was a lot of talk about Greece just a few months ago. And indeed, I think that what happens now in Ireland has an air of déjà vu for those who have followed the Greek crisis. What happens in Greece, in a way, is the laboratory of what happens in at least a whole part of Europe in that way. It is so because of two reasons. The first is that, as you might know, Greece is, in Europe, the country where the crisis is the most severe. And the second reason is a political reason. It is because in Greece, everyone knows, and especially the ruling classes, both in Europe and within the country itself, that the level of social resistance, the level of the popular movements is particularly high, and that in order to pass their measures, they will have to break a very high level of social political organization. Only to remind you that Greece is one of those countries where in the last decade, not to go further back in the past, but in the last decade, in 2001, the trade union movement succeeded in winning the case against the reform of the pension system, which has now been passed through, actually. And in 2006, the magnificent student movement has succeeded in stopping the privatization of higher education in Greece. So they know that, and this is why, indeed, the social confrontation in Greece is a very important test for the social confrontation throughout Europe. I think that the Greek case is especially important to help us reflecting on what was reminded just a few moments ago that many of the speakers during the meeting, which means that we need to draw lessons about, from what has happened in the past, we need to draw lessons about the way a certain number of battles had been lost, and we also need to reflect seriously about what happens concretely now, and not just stand on the level of the general discourses that this is, the crisis of capitalism and that people are asked to pay for the crisis. We, at least we in this room, we know that, right? But we know also that in order to convince people that it will bring something for them to fight, that it will bring something for them to mobilize and to wage a battle, something more than just repeated, this is wrong, is needed. What is needed is the possibility that alternatives do exist and that these alternatives are concrete, not abstract. It means that they have to be focused on specific type of demands. And they need to take into account at least three things, which I will now just list very briefly. The first thing to have in mind is that we need to understand what I would call the geopolitics of crisis. Being a Greek and following what happens in my country allows me to say the following thing. The crisis hits almost the entire capitalist system throughout the world, right? But it hits it unevenly, and we have to understand why. Things doesn't look the same if you are in Greece, where the downturn of the economy this year will be of at least 5%, okay, where unemployment has already reached 13% and will go, according to official figures, up to 20% within a year. It's not the same thing there and not the same thing in Germany or in the other countries of Europe. And think a minute about this fact. Greece came first, now it's Ireland. Now on the list we have Portugal and Spain, which means a certain part of Europe, okay? The so-called periphery of the Eurozone, because there is of course the other periphery, the outer periphery of the Eurozone, which is Eastern Europe, where it has, it is in social ruins since several years. So we have to understand the specific geopolitics of the crisis, and we have also to analyze the way, I will need more than 2 minutes. And we also need to reflect about the way the role the European Union plays, especially in shifting the cost of the crisis in specific countries and organizing a transfer of wealth, not only within the countries themselves, but within a broader unit which is Europe, organizing therefore the transfer of wealth of the working people of Greece to serve first and foremost the German and French banks who own the majority of the Greek public debt, and then, of course, in favor of the Greek banks themselves who own the rest, okay? But 2/3 is owned by German and French banks. That's the first thing. The second thing, which is absolutely important about Greece, is that in Greece, the dominant classes of Greece, with the key support of the European Union and the International Monetary Fund, they have played the card of what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism. They have seen what happens as an opportunity, exactly, to make the point and to put into practice a project which they had in mind since long, to take a social revenge which is necessary since years. So disaster capitalism is exactly the way through which concretely the idea that there is no alternative is implemented. Because we understand a crisis is something real. It's not a trick, it's not an ideological trick of the dominant group. The system is really in crisis. There is no point of return to some kind of imaginary moment just before, the crisis started. You have to respond to the crisis by somehow inventing solutions. And of course, if we not invent our solutions, their solutions will pass through. And their solutions are, in a way, from their standpoint, necessary. So their logic is the whole country gets bankrupt. It's the failure of everything. If you do not agree with what we're doing now, then, it will be the apocalypse, the end of the world. This is how they are trying to implement, actually, their measures in Greece, by creating this apocalyptic atmosphere, which paralyzes, of course, resistance, which paralyzes even the thinking that some kind of another possibility is necessary. Therefore, and I come now to my third point, of course, these measures in Greece have been met by a very high level of resistance. No less than 6 days of general strikes have been waged by the trade union movement. But they have failed. And we have listened to the French comrade as well. This big social movement in France has failed. Why it has failed? Because the trade union movement doesn't have a strategy which is able to meet that level of challenge. And it needs seriously to reflect on that strategy. The strategy of the Greek trade unions, which allowed them to win the case in 2001 against the reform of the pension system, doesn't work now. Something different is needed. So we have really to understand, to think about the mobilizations and the strategy we organize in order to win the case in mobilizations. And my last point will be the following. In order to do that, we need to think concretely about concrete alternatives for the crisis, not abstract ones. If we remain on the level of a purely propagandist, abstract anti-capitalism, we will lose this battle. We have to think about extremely concrete measures that are both radical, that they represent a real break with the logic, a real break with their policy, not a variant of it, not a softer policy of it, not cutting the deficit in 4 years instead of 2 years, okay? A real break with this, but not abstract, imaginary solutions, which doesn't mean anything actually to the majority of the people. If we succeed in doing this, I am certain that in Greece, here and everywhere else, we are able to win. This is the challenge.